Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to continue our study of Egypt on our ongoing overlook of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. You remember we talked about the Archaic period and the Old Kingdom. That was the period of the Pyramid era when most of the pyramids were built. And then we had the first intermediate period where everything sort of fell apart. And it came back together in the Middle Kingdom. That was Dynasties 11 and 12. And this was the era of the biblical patriarchs. This was the time when Abraham came in Genesis chapter 12. And then later on, Joseph and the Israelites came and settled in Egypt in the land of Goshen. And we left off there. But following the Middle Kingdom, now we enter a second intermediate period. Now, after this, we're going to get to the New Kingdom and the Exodus. We'll look at that, and finally, there'll be a third intermediate period. But right now, we want to talk about that second intermediate period from 1786 to 1567. And this is a period where there are outsiders who have come into Egypt. You say, well, the Israelites came into Egypt, yes. But there seemed to have been another group, also Semitic, and they are referred to as the Heka-Kawaset, that is, the chieftains of a foreign country. Sometimes we refer to these more commonly by the Greek term, the Hyksos, which Josephus and others in his day thought referred to those as the shepherd kings. Nowadays, most scholars have rejected that interpretation, even though Josephus thought it was the case. That it refers instead to these chieftains of a foreign country. In other words, foreign rulers who come in and they rule Egypt. Now, do they come in and invade Egypt, or do they gradually migrate and then eventually get power? Scholars are divided on this. The history is not entirely clear, but eventually they do take power, especially in the north. And so these Hyksos, these rulers of countries, not shepherd kings, although there may have been some shepherds among them. They rule Egypt now during this second intermediate period. They rule the northern part. In other words, they're ruling lower Egypt, not upper Egypt, Egypt being that part of Egypt that's in the south. They are Semitic peoples, and so they rule, but eventually, as we get to the New Kingdom, they are going to be driven out. One of the things that the Hyksos have brought, they bring chariots, not the old solid-wheel chariots that had been so prevalent at an earlier date in Mesopotamia, but chariots built on a light frame with spoked wheels. And suddenly, that mobilizes warfare. It does what ancient warfare, it does for that which the tank and the plane did for modern warfare. That warfare suddenly becomes highly mobile. And the Hyksos introduced that into Egypt. Now, the Egyptians eventually are going to get chariots of their own, and that will bring the second intermediate period to a close. You have this division, the Hyksos ruling in the north, in lower Egypt. At the same time, there's a separate dynasty which is ruling in the south. The 17th dynasty of Egypt is ruling from Thebes. These are Egyptians, and they eventually succeed in driving out the Hyksos, and that will give rise to the 18th dynasty. It will be the 18th dynasty that finishes driving the driving the Hyksos out of Egypt. And they will now be established as the ruling dynasty, and it will be the 18th dynasty that will see Egypt at its very highest. They adopt the chariot. Now this scene is taken from a treasure chest that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, but Tutankhamun never got on a chariot and went into warfare. So it's actually depicting the Egyptians of an earlier time, earlier in his own dynasty, because he will be 18th dynasty, but he'll be toward the end. And the depiction here is an earlier group fighting against the Asiatics. Remember, the Hyksos are Asiatics. And it depicts how the Egyptians have taken now that war chariot, and they are putting it to good use. Now, another thing that we see about the 18th dynasty is that they begin to bury their dead not in pyramids or mastabas, but since they're descending, they're coming from Thebes in the south, they bury their kings in what's come to be known as the Valley of the Kings. Now, we already said that they would bury people in the west. All the pyramids are located to the west of the Nile. And likewise, the Valley of the Kings is located on the west side of the Nile River. A great way to see that Valley of the Kings, here's an overview map that shows both the Valley of the Kings. There's also a separate Valley of the Queens, and then there's some places that are sort of in between. We'll look at those in just a moment. And then the temples of Karnak and Thebes, Luxor Temple in Thebes, and Karnak Temple just to the north of that, are on the east side of the Nile, because that's the land of the living. A great way to see the Temple of the Valley of the Kings is to get up very early in the morning and get yourself a hot air balloon. It's I don't know how safe it is, but my wife and I did this a number of years ago and had a delightful time. Of course, when you're in a hot air balloon, you're going to go wherever the wind takes you. You can't change directions. But they plan it very nicely where you go up over the Nile, and then you find yourself in a sort of with a bird's eye view of both the Valley of the Kings. That's in the background. You can see that valley, and then in the foreground you see up against the escarpment the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, and we'll speak of her in just a moment, because one of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty was not a man but a woman. Here's a close-up of that mortuary temple, one of the more beautiful sites and temples there in Egypt. Now, it was Hamosis who was the founder of this dynasty. If the latter part of his name sounds a little bit like Moses, that's intentional. It's not that they were being named after Moses, but the term Moses means to be drawn out of or to be born out of, because when a child is born, he's drawn out of his mother. And so Moses means drawn out of And we're going to have Thutmose, drawn out of Tut, who was one of the other Egyptian gods. And so that name is going to come up again and again and again. Now we have Moses, Amenhotep, since there's going to be a few of them, we'll call this one Amenhotep the First. And then Thutmose, and there'll be a few of them too, the first. And they have a royal daughter. Now they probably have a lot of other children too, that is, Thutmose does, because he's got a number of wives. But one that's the established royal family, and that's Hatshepsut, and that's a daughter that's born, and he doesn't have any sons born of that union, and that leads to a problem, because you need a pharaoh. And so he marries Hatshepsut off, and she is married to a man who takes the name Thutmose II, who becomes the pharaoh because he's married to Hatshepsut. I don't know if it was a really happy marriage. Sometimes royal marriages are just there because they have to be. But when Thutmose II dies, he has two daughters, and he's also got a son by a sort of a secondary marriage, and that's going to be Thutmose III. And Thutmose III will eventually be the pharaoh, but he's rather young when his father dies, and so Hatshepsut, she takes not just the regency, she takes the crown. She wears the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and she becomes not the queen, she becomes the pharaoh, the king. And even when Thutmose III gets older, so that he's old enough to reign, she holds on to the crown. She continues to be the pharaoh until she dies. A woman ruling as the pharaoh. Very, not entirely unknown, but very unusual indeed. And what's more, Hatshepsut seems to have done quite a good job as the pharaoh of Egypt. She, like we said, she takes the royal headdress, but also it is a time of peace. There's not a lot of warfare. She's not going off into battle a lot. Rather, there is a time of peace and prosperity as she invigorates the trading that goes to other countries. And Egypt sees quite a good and peaceful period in their history. Her mortuary temple, let's look up close on that, is prepared and has statues of her and inscriptions about her. But we only know about her in recent history because when her stepson, when she dies and Thutmose III comes to the throne, one of the first things, well, I don't know if it was the first thing he did, eventually what he does, he blots her name out. Wherever there's an inscription that talks about Hatshepsut, it is whitewashed over and covered with plaster so that no one might know who she is. The statues that are of her, her name is either chiseled out or scratched over or in some way covered up, and were it not for the fact that some of the plaster had fallen off, we would know absolutely nothing about Hatshepsut, this pharaoh queen. Well, I'm going to call her king, but a woman who rules as pharaoh over Egypt. Could it be? You see, this is going to be around the same time that we, as I understand the chronology, that we read about Moses being found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. I don't want to say that Hatshepsut is that daughter, because I don't know. I suppose it could be, but the Pharaoh had a number of daughters, both from lesser and greater wives, and so there's nothing that says this has to be Hatshepsut. But it's around that time, if I understand the chronology correctly, that Moses is born and rises in Egypt to a place of prominence. As we said, once she dies, Thutmose III comes to the throne. Eventually, he is going to have her name obliterated from both the monuments and the king lists, so that Egypt will forget Hatshepsut. And Thutmose III now is going to be the pharaoh. He's a rather short man, but like Napoleon, in fact, we can describe him as the Napoleon of Egypt. Like Napoleon, he is going to conquer most of the known world. He will make 17 different campaigns from Egypt, leaving Egypt and marching all the way to the Euphrates, where he will batter the kingdom of Mitanni into submission and indeed will bring it crashing to its fall. He also takes, now you see two obelisks here. Look particularly at the one on the left that is partially covered up. He doesn't pull down that is the obelisk of Hatshepsut. He doesn't pull it down. That would be a bit brazen. Instead, he builds a big giant wall all around it. Now, some of that wall has fallen down now, but you can see part of it still standing. Part of it obscures the obelisk. And in his day, that obelisk was sealed up with a wall on all four sides to hide it from public view so that anyone going into the temple of Karnak would not see it. We're going to pretend that she doesn't exist. Now, his son comes to the throne around 1450 BC. He's going to reign, the chronology is a little difficult here, but around 25 years. Amenhotep II. And Amenhotep II, unlike his father, Thutmose III was a rather small man. We know this from looking at his mummy. In the case of Amenhotep II, he's a great big man, and he is intending to follow in the footsteps of his father, that he will also go out and conquer and be the great conqueror. And certainly in the first 5 years of his reign, he does conduct a campaign like that. First, he goes down to the south, and he beats the rebellious Nubians into submission. takes one of their princes and flays his body alive and hangs it on the front of his ship, his barge, and then sails back down the Nile with that body sort of fluttering in the breeze. And then he conducts a campaign into through Canaan and toward Mesopotamia. And it looks like he's going to be just can I call it a chip off the old block? He looks like he's going to be another Thutmose III. But then, after that first campaign, he comes back to Egypt, and he stops all military action and never again sets foot out of Egypt. What happened? What took place? You see, the Bible talks about a time when Egypt saw great plagues, 10 different plagues, the last one being the plague of the firstborn. And the chronology, I believe, fits here, that this is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. When we read in Exodus chapter 13, verse 18, as the Israelites are allowed to leave Egypt, we'll come back and talk about this in more length, that God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in martial array from the land of Egypt. Now, that phrase, Red Sea, the Hebrew there is Yam Suf, and that has caused some wrong thinking, I think. Yam Suf, Yam is the Hebrew word for sea, Suf is the word for reeds, and because of that, there have been those who thought, the Israelites, when they crossed, they left Egypt, they didn't cross the Red Sea, they just crossed the Sea of Reeds, and there's these lakes that are known as the Bitter Lakes, and there's some reeds growing around there, and maybe they just sort of waited to cross the water, and the Egyptians tried to follow them, and they got their chariots all stuck in the mud, and that wasn't all that much of a miracle, and somehow that got turned into the Egyptians drowning. That's the point of view of skeptics. I think it's wrong. The reason that it's wrong is because we know from elsewhere in the Bible that the term Yam Suf doesn't refer to just a lake, it refers to what we call the Red Sea. Now, they didn't call it the Red Sea back in ancient times. That's a taken from a Greek term. But the Hebrews always called that place, what we call the Red Sea, they called it Yam Suf. In fact, in 1 Kings chapter 6, we read of Solomon building a fleet of ships at Eilat, on what we call the Gulf of Aqaba, but still part of that Red Sea. And the Bible says, and he built that fleet of ships on Yam Suf, on the Sea of Reeds, because that's what they referred to it as. So it's not, we don't have the Israelites crossing just at this place of these lakes. There was a National Geographic article back in the 1970s that suggested that maybe the Israelites crossed. There's a sort of a bar of sand out into the Mediterranean, and somebody wrote an article. Haven't seen anything much on that since, and that's simply not true, because we're told that they did not go the way of the Philistines, and that would have been the way of the Philistines. They didn't go that route either. Instead, the traditional route has them starting to go out into the wilderness, but then turning and coming back, and then crossing the northern arm of the Red Sea. By the way, there's a new theory, relatively new, that says, no, they didn't cross there. They actually went all the way down into Sinai and then crossed at the Gulf of Aqaba. It's only about 200 feet deep, but still pretty deep. And it was there that the waters were parted. The problem there is just having enough time. It won't fit into the chronology that's given to us in Exodus chapter 13 and 14, and then is repeated later on in the book of Deuteronomy. We have a sort of laying out how long it took to take, and unless they had 10-speed bicycles or motorpeds, they just wouldn't have had enough time to get down there. It's quite a long distance to make the crossing there and still do all the things that they did after they had crossed the Red Sea. So I rather discount that. Exodus chapter 14 and verse 3 talks about how they were told to turn around and go, so that the Pharaoh would say of the sons of Israel, they had left and then turn around, and the Pharaoh would be saying, hey, they're wandering aimlessly in the land, the wilderness has shut them in, let's just go collect them all. And that's what happens the Pharaoh goes out to try to retake the Israelites once they've departed from the land. We read of the Pharaoh that he took 600 select chariots. This was the time, where Egypt had its great chariot corps. Thutmose III had been using them to invade Mesopotamia. That he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over them. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind. Now, we shouldn't think that this is, I know in some of the movies they picture this little tiny tunnel opening up through this. No, it's rather spread apart by the seas. We call this, in those of us that live down in Florida, we're used to hurricanes, we refer to tidal surge. And it's not really tides, it's what happens. The wind actually either blows a lot of water up onto land, and sometimes the water levels go up by 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 feet because of these hurricane force winds. Now, we're not told it's hurricane force winds, but a strong east wind blew all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. And the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land. The waters were like a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. But it doesn't say that it's a wall right there, 2 feet away. That it may have been, miles and miles apart, so that they crossed en masse over the dried sea. Yes, it was a miracle, but a miracle both of the wind and a miracle of timing as well for this to take place. Now, Thutmose IV, this is after the Exodus. He's the next pharaoh that's going to come along from 1425 to 1417 BC. When Thutmose comes to the throne, the first thing that he does is, and we mentioned this last week, that you look at the Sphinx and there is a big giant inscription on a slab between its paws. It was not there when the Sphinx was made. It was placed there at a later date. It was placed there by Thutmose IV. And in his day, as he becomes pharaoh, the Exodus has already taken place, as he becomes pharaoh, he clears the sand from around the Sphinx. Very oftentimes the wind over a period of days and weeks and months and years and centuries would pile up against the Sphinx so that it would be almost buried. He orders the sand to be cleared, and he puts this inscription, and this inscription tells the story about how when he was a young man that a prophet came to him and told him that he would reign in place of his older brother who was supposed to be pharaoh, but something happened to that older brother, and now Thutmose IV had become pharaoh in the place of his older brother, and he writes the story, in remembering how it had been prophesied that this would be the case. Here we have Thutmose III. We said that he's going to have Amenhotep II, the pharaoh. I take that to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. And Amenhotep II has two sons, one the unnamed older brother, and the one who eventually does become pharaoh, the younger brother, Thutmose IV. And of course we ask the question, what happened to the older brother? And if that is indeed the pharaoh of the Exodus, we know what happened to the older brother. He was the son of the pharaoh who died as the firstborn in all of Egypt died. Now, Thutmose IV is going to have his reign as pharaoh, and after he has died, his son, Amenhotep III, will come to the throne. In the days of Amenhotep III, as he is now pharaoh, we have found some tablets dating to his day at Amarna. That's a location that's it's south of Cairo and Memphis and those areas of Lower Egypt, but it's north of Thebes. It's sort of in the middle between those two locations. And at Amarna, a woman was she was actually digging up some rocks, and she'd found some tablets. And she said, "This will make good fertilizer. I can sort of grind them up." And somebody said, maybe you ought to see if you can sell those instead. And sure enough, they tended to be. They were found and discovered to be very old tablets dating back to Amenhotep III's day, and they had not originated in Egypt, at least not all of them. One of them in particular was a letter from the king of Jerusalem, the Canaanite king of Jerusalem, writing to Amenhotep III saying, hey, I really need some help. In this letter from the king of Jerusalem to Amenhotep III, he says, the Habiru are plundering all the lands of the king, and if no troops come in this very year, then all the lands of the king over here in Canaan, over here in Jerusalem, are going to be lost. What was happening here? Egypt was no longer conducting its raids and exercising authority and sovereignty over foreign lands like the land of Canaan. And as a result, I have this group of people, the Habiru. Now, Habiru is a reference to those people who are wanderers, outsiders. They're outsiders who are coming in. And these Habiru were coming up against the land of Jerusalem and against the land of Canaan. Who are they? Well, that term Habiru sounds suspiciously like Hebrew. And it might be that they have a common origin, that they were both looked at as outsiders and wanderers. And here's these outsiders under Joshua now, a full generation after they had left the land and been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Now they are coming into the land of Canaan. We go to the next king, the next pharaoh, because at a later date we'll go back and look at Joshua. But for now we're going to look at Amenhotep IV, but he does not keep the name Amenhotep IV. Instead, he soon takes the name Akhenaten. He had been named for the god Amen, and instead he's going to say, I'm not going to worship Amen anymore. Instead, we're going to worship Aten. Aten is the sun god, and he changes his name to reflect that new worship. In fact, he says, not only are we going to worship Aten the sun, that will be the only god that we are going to worship. He is the first Egyptian pharaoh to say, we are going to be monotheists. Now, I didn't say he's the first monotheist, because I don't think he is. I think he is not original. I think he's doing this because he remembers an earlier generation when there had been those in Egypt who worshipped one god. And he said, look what happened to them. They were allowed to leave, and their God defeated Egypt when Egypt was at its very strongest. Maybe they have something there. Maybe this idea of worshiping one God can really pay dividends. And so he says, now they don't go and worship Yahweh. Maybe that would have been a great way to go. But instead they worship Aten. And he says, we're just going to worship one God, both he and his son. And he leads Egypt in monotheism. Now, they're not going to stay that way. Once he dies, Egypt is going to leave that worship, and they're going to turn around, and they're going to go back and be polytheists again. This will happen with as his son comes to the throne. His son is only a boy when his father dies, and his son his name is changed back. It had originally been Tutankhaten. It will now be Tutankhamen. It will be changed back. He's only 9 years old as he becomes the boy king. And his name is changed from Tutankhaten back to the familiar to us, Tutankhamen. Now, there will be under his reign a return to the old religious system, not because he's so enthralled about that, but because he probably has some priests that are telling him what to do. And he is being told, if you want to continue to be Pharaoh, you're going to make these changes. And I guess he does want to continue to be Pharaoh. He's not going to live for very long. He comes to the throne. He's 9 years old. He will only be reigning up until the age of 17, 18. He won't get out of his teen years before he dies. Egypt during this period is showing its lack of military strength because, remember, the Pharaoh was also the general and leader of the Egyptian armies. This boy's just a boy. How can he lead anything? In fact, we would probably know nothing about him were it not for the fact that his tomb was discovered. Well, that's no big deal. Lots of tombs were discovered. But his tomb was discovered intact. When the tomb of Tutankhamen was found, grave robbers had not managed to gain entry and to loot it. It was found by a explorer named Howard Carter in 1922. He had a wealthy patron who was backing his expedition in the Valley of the Kings, and they found this tomb, and they found that it was completely intact. They looked through it. It looked like it had, the things that were in it were not necessarily orderly. Some of them were sort of just junked in there, but they looked in, and they were incredibly ornate, wonderfully valuable items of gold, mostly gold, some silver, I suppose, bread, all sorts of things that a pharaoh might need for the afterlife. Included in that was the sarcophagus. Now, that's an interesting word, a sarcophagus. That's not an Egyptian word. That's what the Greeks called it. The Greek word for body or flesh is sarx, and they opened up this box and they said, "Gee, look in there. There's this body, and it's all sort of decomposed. It looks like somebody ate it up." So they called it a sarcophagus. That is a body eater. A sarcophagus means body eater, and that's what the Greeks referred to it. But it was a coffin, and inside was a statue, and inside that was a smaller statue and a smaller statue, and finally, when you went down deep enough, you found the mummy of the boy king Tutankhamun. Included in that were a number of other artifacts, things that he might need for his journey. A wonderful set of riches that are now on display at the Egyptian Museum. Every once in a while, they'll take them and send them on a journey. In fact, they were in the United States for a year, traveling in different exhibits, and people over here were able to see them. Managed to see them in both places, both here and in Egypt, and that's a wonderful thing. Gold and precious stones. The workmanship is absolutely breathtaking. A throne chair depicting Tutankhamun and his sister/bride. And included in that were a number of artifacts that remind us of some of the things that the Israelites have in the wilderness. For example, there is what I'm going to refer to as an ark, a box that has poles by which it is carried, and the image of some sort of creature on top. It reminds me a little bit of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but the structure and the workmanship does put me in mind of those things that the Israelites had. After all, they had come out of Egypt. They had learned how to do craftsmanship from Egypt, from the same people who eventually would build these things that we find in Tutankhamun's tomb. Another thing that was found was what I'm going to describe as a tabernacle, or sort of a portable temple, that contained the organs of the king. This elaborate box / portable, I'm going to refer to it as a tabernacle. Around the king himself and his tabernacle, there was a framework that held curtains, a tent that was built around the body of the king. That sounds a little familiar, because the Israelites are going to worship in a portable tent, in a tabernacle. Now, the next ruler, I'm not even sure if I'm going to call him a pharaoh, but Ai becomes the next ruler of Egypt. After all, Tutankhamun dies. He does not have a son. He's only not even out of his teens himself. He's still fairly young. And he had been the co-regent of Tutankhamun, and he tries to marry Ankhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun. She's also in her teens. Tries to marry her. And we have a letter that she writes to Suppiluliuma, the king of the Hittites. And she writes this letter. She says, "My husband," she refers to him as Nibkururia, probably another name for Tutankhamun. Remember, the pharaoh had a number of different names. This is the name that she's willing to give out to somebody else. His own personal name might be protected. But my husband has recently died, and I have no son. But your sons, they say, are many. If you will send me a son of yours, he shall become my husband. And so the plan is that one of the princes of the Hittites is going to come down and marry Suppiluliuma, the former bride, the widow of Tutankhamun, and presumably a son is sent. A son is sent from the Hittites down to Egypt, and that son never makes it alive because he is intercepted and murdered. Now, we next have a pharaoh named Horemheb. We're in a transitional period between the 18th and 19th dynasties. He's going to reign from 1348 to 1320. He's already sort of elderly when he comes to the throne. And after he dies, there will be a new dynasty established, beginning with Ramses, and there'll be a few of them. So Ramses the First, or can I call his name Rameses? Again, that one who's drawn out of Ra, son of Ra, but I still see that Moses term in here. So Ramses the First, he's going to be followed by Seti, who will be followed by Ramses the Second, and nearly everyone has heard of Ramses the Second. In fact, quite often they'll make a movie about Moses, and they'll describe the Pharaoh of the Exodus as Ramses the Second. They are wrong, I believe. I think they're missing it by an entire dynasty. But Ramses the Second, nevertheless, is going to be quite famous in his own right. One of the things that Ramses does, Ramses II I'm speaking of, he's going to build statues of himself everywhere, all throughout Egypt. Here's one that's lying down in the Ramseyed, a huge statue. You go down to Abu Simbel, which is as far south as you can be. It's right on the Sudanese border. And at Abu Simbel, you have these four great statues. One of them sort of crumbled because of an earthquake. But these four huge statues, and they're all of Ramses. He loved to make statues of himself. In fact, somebody has suggested that this might have been where they got the idea in the United States for putting on the side of a mountain, Mount Rushmore, with the faces of four presidents. Can you imagine what we would think of perhaps the current president if he put his own face on four, he maybe carved off the face of the faces that are there on Mount Rushmore and put his own face on each one of them? We would have thought, my goodness, what an ego. Well, Ramses the Second does the same thing. I'm not sure in this case, I think this was made of him. But he was not above finding statues of other pharaohs and crossing out their name and putting his own name on there. He does this on a number of occasions. Here at Abu Simbel, it's quite astounding because here is a temple. Now, it's not a mortuary temple, but it's a temple dedicated to Ramses. And it's so far south, you're not actually in Egypt. You're on the outer border of Egypt, so that anyone traveling from Nubia in the south is going to pass this huge, giant temple with these huge, giant statues of Ramses. I say perhaps it's a propaganda piece. It's looking at, I'm very big and you don't want to mess with me, Ramses seems to be saying. Incidentally, this entire assemblage was in danger of being submerged underwater. Back in the 1960s, they had put a dam up at the first cataract, and so the Nile River was growing and forming what would come to be known as Lake Nasser, and it would submerge completely that temple. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, the American United States Army Corps of Engineers, was instrumental in going and cutting that temple apart and relocating it from its former place to a place above the new water line where it stands now. When you go there, you're seeing the actual temple, but it's been moved. Now, that ancient temple, notice it has a doorway. If you were allowed to go through that doorway, you would see a long hall with giant columns, and on the side would be a inscription of Ramses' one great battle. He went and fought a battle at Kadesh against the Hittites. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the Hittites. It was constructed in such a way that twice a year, on the anniversary of Ramses' birthday and also on the anniversary of his coronation day, the rising sun, the beams would go through the door. They would go down the long hallway with the statues of Ramses, and over on one side you have his description of his one famous battle that he fought, and they would go deep into the temple, into the innermost part where you had a statue of Ramses seated with him seated, flanked on one side by Isis, on the other by Osiris, and then in the shadow would be a fourth image, and that would be the image of Set, the god of darkness. And the rising sun, given that if it was a clear day, that light would shine upon Ramses and those two gods, but it would still leave Set in darkness. As we said, the Army of Corps of Engineers tried to replicate this when they moved the temple. They tried to position it where, again, on Ramses' birthday and on his coronation day, it would still shine just the same way. They did, but they missed it by a day. As good as they were, and they did a wonderful job. It's now one day off. And so you get to see it if you happen to be there either of those 2 days of the year, but you have to be one day off from his birthday and one day off, and I don't remember if it's before or after his coronation day. Ramses was known for building up and down Egypt, so for that he is, I suppose we can call him the Great. At least he thought he was great. At Karnak Temple, no, the temple was already standing in his day, but he took it and expanded it greatly. You can see the huge colonnades of the hypostatic hall, that is the hall that once had a roof. It was an indoor hall. Marvelous construction. And you can go through the halls. You can see images of Ramses everywhere you turn. There are statues of him inside, of him outside, and all throughout. And when the statue was not of him, he was not above scratching the name that was on the statue off and putting his own name in its place. I remember he does this once with a statue that is now thought to be Tutankhamun, and now it says that it's Ramses. Ramses, he leaves his mark on history, if not for his great actions, at least for his great propaganda machine. He is followed by Merneptah, who his claim to fame, he writes a stela, and it makes mention of his military endeavors. Ramses had only, in his very long career, had only had one military endeavor. That was against the Hittites, and we're going to talk about that at length when we look at the Hittites. But Merneptah talks about how he has gone up against, among other places, he has gone up against, and he makes reference to Israel. And he makes reference to Israel not as a nomadic people, but as people in a land, the Israelites. And so he makes reference to his fighting against them and probably carrying some of their possessions off as booty. But by this time we know that Israel is in the land as an established people. Now finally we want to speak about Ramses III. He's perhaps the last of the great ones. After this we'll have a number of pharaohs all named Ramses, and the 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way up to goodness, who knows how many. But they're looking back to either Ramses II or Ramses III. And Ramses III, his claim to fame is keeping Egypt free, because Egypt will see an invasion of the Sea Peoples. A group of people, probably seems like they are coming from the Aegean and other locations around that. And they come sweeping down on both land and sea, but they are seen in the wall paintings on their boats as they try to invade Egypt. Ramses stops them, he counters the invasion, and then as part of the following peace treaty, he allows some of them to settle along the shores in the southern part of the land of Canaan, where they become known as the Peleset, or in the Bible we read of them as the Philistines, and they build 5 cities along the coast, and they are in the land, even though Israel is now in the land and beginning to take possession of especially the areas of the Shephelah, that is the foothills, and the mountain regions. It is the Philistines who have their cities on the plain in the southern part of Canaan. And we'll look at that next week.